Hey, listeners, welcome back to Sustainability Street, our podcast on the intersection of commercial real estate and the worlds we live in. I'm your host, Therese Fitzgerald. For this episode, I'm focusing on CRE's power problem. The U.S. grid is struggling to keep up with the growing power requirements of industrial real estate users, and data centers take that demand to a whole new level. I'm lucky to have with me today two JLL executives who are well versed in these challenges and the potential solutions, both the current ones and the future ones. Joining me are Meaghan Elwell, Global President of JLL's Industrials business within Work Dynamics, and Josephine Tucker, America's Head of Energy Advisory and Sustainability. We discuss why power needs are surging, the wide-reaching impacts of voracious demand for power, and how industrial users and data center companies are managing to grow despite supply and demand imbalances. I think you will really enjoy this one and learn a lot too. Hi, Meaghan and Josephine. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Great to be here.
So power has become a really important topic for commercial real estate executives. Meaghan, why don't you start by introducing yourself and telling us how power demand and supply is impacting your practice area?
Sure, I can start. So I am our global division president for the industrials division at JLL, where we serve occupiers and we manage all elements of their real estate from site selection to ongoing building management and advisory services along the way. We focus on 9 different industries, including utilities, manufacturing, automotive, oil and gas, aviation, and logistics. So certainly many of my clients are both in the energy business and also are major consumers of energy.
I'm Josephine. I lead energy advisory and sustainability for the Americas at JLL. We cover end-to-end sustainability services for all of JLL's corporate occupier clients, as well as our property management and investor clients. So our business is about 500 people focused on everything from consulting services, delivery of operational sustainability programs such as energy, waste, water management, reporting, things like that, but also technical engineering services, project development, and our transactional teams are more engaged with the securitization and negotiation of energy supply contracts, as well as some on-site technologies that significantly interface with their energy supply, like EV charging, battery storage, microgrids. So we really do cover a really broad spectrum of services related to the energy that our clients consume.
So why are the demand for power and concerns over access to power spiking today? What are the drivers and how is JLL helping clients address that?
Great question. And as an energy nerd, this is one of my favorite topics to discuss. In the last few years, we have seen this tremendous uptick in demand for power, and this is mostly being driven by data centers. However, the onshoring and reshoring of manufacturing and the electrification of everything from buildings to cars to infrastructure is all contributing as well. And utilities have really struggled to keep up. For the last 50 years or so, there was almost no demand growth. And so our grid system was more or less operating fine. Now, demand is far outpacing supply, and it's happening at a speed at which they are just not able to build new power plants or invest in the transmission and distribution infrastructure needed to deliver that power. So in the short term, this basically leads to pricing spikes and increases in an attempt to moderate that demand. And we're already seeing that. So in some markets, we're actually seeing a 25 to 30% increase in electricity prices over the next few years. And for a lot of Meaghan's clients, or any other large scale commercial client that uses a ton of energy, this is a big problem because energy can represent 25, 30% of their total lease value. So that's a significant operational cost item. And significant increases like this over a short period of time can put some of the more particularly sensitive companies out of business, as we saw in Europe during the energy crisis that spiked over the conflict with Ukraine. The good news is it's not all doom and gloom. To answer the second part of your question, JLL is helping our clients in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, we always try to work with clients to reduce their energy consumption. If we can implement energy efficiency measures or conservation measures that will reduce their energy burden at the root cause, that's the first step. Second, we're helping clients to optimize energy supply and demand on site. So this might include, something more related to procurement, so renegotiating of their utility supply contracts, or something more CapEx or project-based, which would require some installation of on-site energy projects or switching of fuels, everything from solar to battery storage to microgrids. Those are some of the technologies that we're seeing clients get a lot more adept at taking up in order to manage their supply and demand.
Meaghan, did you want to add to that?
I think Josephine covered it really well. There's such a massive, like in so many different parts of the industry, generally the world, what we're seeing in particular in the US, it's the reshoring, it's data centers, the use of AI, and also it's supply chain. This started to happen during the pandemic where many companies realized that having a global supply chain wasn't necessarily a perfect situation if you couldn't get the inputs that you needed to build the products that you're trying to get to your customers, or if there are specific things that are critical to your operations and those are coming from part of the world that is inaccessible for any given time, it made companies realize that they needed to create some redundancy. So we've started to see over the last 5 years this increase of warehousing for inventory storage, having more inventory, doing more manufacturing, closer nearshoring. So yeah, absolutely. All of these things are connected and are creating the situation that we're in now.
Speaking of industrial clients, Meaghan, a recent JLL report said that power is the new real estate. I think that's really true for industrial. How are power demands and power deficits impacting industrial users when it comes to site selection?
Yeah, the site selection is a really important piece of it. If a company is looking to open a new site, and whether that's a data center or a distribution center or a manufacturing site, power is essential. And we talk about it with the 3 Ps, the people, power, and place. Place and people take longer, as it turns out, if you get it wrong. It takes longer to recover from that, can take a whole generation to recover from that. For power, it can be a short term in the next 5 or 6 years issue. So right now, what we see is only about 2% of land that is industrial zoned is actually ready, build ready with power and utilities already there. And then on top of that, if the power isn't there, it can take up to 6 years. So we are seeing from a site selection standpoint, companies that are looking for greenfield are having to reimagine what that looks like, whether that's, bringing in alternative sources of energy or thinking differently about their use of energy, their consumption. And then for existing sites, there is some reimagining going on with a site that maybe was built for one purpose that they're looking to repurpose for something different, because no question, much of the work that happens is power intensive. So we're also seeing things like micro reactors that are coming up and other ways that companies are looking to create that almost self-generate power. And that's where infrastructure comes in with microgrids. If you can put solar in and have the batteries to store it, there are other ways to be creative. But no question, this is a massive issue.
When we spoke before, you also spoke about the need for power-related personnel and how that can be a factor in site selection too today.
Absolutely. I mean, personnel, period. So I was talking to somebody yesterday. The client has just built a new site, a data center site in Central Texas, which was great for power in this particular location. But as it turns out, it's really hard to hire people. So that's a big issue. If you've got a place and you've got power there, if you don't have people that can work there, that's a problem. And that is something that we're seeing around, especially in the US, but even globally, the demand for technicians, for people in the skilled trades that can do this work in these industrial sites is more than the supply that's available. So we're certainly looking at all kinds of ways to be creative around that. We're doing partnerships, creating partnerships with trade schools and getting to people early before they're in their careers, even to think about reimagining a career in the built environment that maybe they hadn't thought about before. And I do think AI will help us as well in that regard, as we collectively, as an industry around the built environment, get more savvy and find opportunities to leverage AI that will help us from a people standpoint, but it's certainly not going to help us from a power standpoint. So
Yeah.
it's, solving one issue could create a different issue.
Right. My son worked at a trade college in Pennsylvania, and nuclear technology was one of their majors, along with electrical and carpentry and the others.
That's fantastic. And that's certainly a trend that we're hearing and talking a lot about. That, as I understand it, there are not that many states in the US today, and Josephine probably could speak more to this. There are not that many states in the US today that are nuclear friendly, quote unquote, but there are several nuclear power companies that we work with that are very busy and they're innovating, which is exciting, and thinking about creating scenarios that can affect the global power industry and, eventually make it to the US as well.
Let's talk more about data centers. I don't think there's a conversation today about data centers that doesn't include power and where's the power going to come from. Access to water is another sticking point. How are you helping those users with site selection and power management challenges?
Josephine, I'm going to flip to you first on this one.
Yeah, happy to. And I'm glad that you're calling out data centers specifically. While our industrial clients certainly have energy intensive operations, data centers are really in a category all of their own. The interesting thing is that we may start to see some competition between data centers from a site selection standpoint and industrial customers. But before I get to that, I'll just say you're absolutely right. Power, water, land, those are all critically important factors when siting a new data center. But from a capacity standpoint, that's where it's gotten really interesting. So we've seen a pretty significant increase in recent years in terms of the total energy load that a data center would need. It used to be that, 100, 200 megawatt site was a big data center. And we didn't see a lot of locations that were going over that. Now, with the advent of AI, and just the computational processing capacity that's needed and the demand that end users have for real-time information, that has all really spurned these exponential kind of increases. So some data center capacity requests that I've seen are upwards of 500 megawatts, even up to a gigawatt of power, and that is a significant spike, right? That could be enough to power an entire mid-sized city.
Yeah.
There just aren't, like Meaghan said, there just aren't that many shovel-ready sites with power supply at that magnitude. 2% of availability is extraordinarily constrained. So then it becomes more of a negotiation with the utility to request the power that's needed and get in the queue. And basically that grid interconnection is backlogged by 4 to 5 years. So then the question is, can you afford to wait 4 to 5 years to develop your data center and risk losing, what's the opportunity cost of not being able to participate in this transformational moment that's happening with AI? So that is just not on the table, right? So a lot of our clients are actually more interested in finding creative solutions, like Meaghan said, identifying bridging power solutions, semi-permanent gas or backup generation, and using a portion of the power that they need from the utility, while they're waiting those 4 to 5 years for new power to come online. In some cases, data centers are actually taking power into their own hands. We started to see with some of the hyperscalers, Google and Meta investing into large utility scale energy projects. And I think we're going to see more of that. It'll also be potentially better for residential customers and smaller businesses who stand significant rate increases and reliability issues due to this onslaught of demand.
Yeah, and the utilities have started to acknowledge that, to say, we get it, we're seeing this, we're feeling this, and we need to do something different to focus on our residential, the everyday person, to not be competing with these massive power consumers. So I do think we'll start to see some of that over time. And
Yep.
Utilities that are regulated have to do rate cases every few years.
Mhm.
So I suspect that we'll start to see some of the economics change, some of the commercial models potentially change as it relates to data centers in particular. And Josephine, just on the note that as you're talking about the data centers and companies thinking about their own power sources, my understanding is that most data centers that are going in today, or that are, as they're doing site selection, have to put some kind of a microreactor or something, a substation on site in order to supplement power. I think that's happening certainly in many places, which is interesting. And thinking about the site selection process, I've heard many stories where companies have gone out to market looking for a certain amount of power. And this is industrial clients. This is not data centers that have gone out looking for, asking for a specific amount of power, and they're having to pull that back, partially because they're saying that's maybe what we need over the next 5 years, but let's focus just on what we need in the next 1 or 2 years and go from there. So as the power providers, the utilities industry is ramping up their capacity, they can meet clients where they are in the demand curve.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing, to give a little bit of credit to the innovation going on in the utility sector, we're also seeing process reform. So it used to be that this grid interconnection queue, and it was a completely equalized system. So it's just based on first in, first served, regardless of where the project is or how much you need. And now we're starting to see more of a clustering approach. So utilities are looking at all of the power requests in a given area, and then looking to develop their own infrastructure plans around these clusters of demand. The other thing that we're seeing is more of a financial requirement for applications, so that we don't have a backlog of false demand, because there's a lot of speculative developers. This is more so on the energy production side, who want to get in the queue, and they just kind of have a placeholder, but maybe their project doesn't get financed, or for whatever reason, it doesn't proceed. And that takes a long time to trickle then through to, our utilities and to the regulatory framework. So I think it's a good thing that we're starting to see some of that process improvement, because that will help to mitigate the demand and not just rely so much on pricing as that downward pressure.
Yeah.
That's interesting. When you were talking about data centers competing with industrial, I was remembering a panel discussion that I sat in on at a conference, and they were talking about multifamily competing with data centers. Data centers take up a lot of land, and that's less land there is for housing.
Yeah, I mean, back to the comment that there are only 2% of land that is zoned as industrial has power. That is a really small percentage. So when the power is needed now, data centers are, that are ready to go up, industrial sites that are ready to go up, there's only so much supply available.
Yeah. Josephine, let's talk a little bit more about the role of renewable energy and new types of energy in satisfying the demand for power. Are these sources making a difference on the supply side, or is it more aspirational?
I think it's a little bit of column A, column B. First and foremost, I have always believed that a diversified portfolio is the best way to approach many problems, whether we're talking about the generation mix of energy supply, or we're talking about, food in your diet. Diversity is typically a good thing. And it's as simple as this: there just isn't enough power to go around. And certainly not when you're only categorizing it by our traditional sources. If you look at the capital intensiveness of building a new power plant, whether it's coal, gas, nuclear, we're talking about billions of dollars of investment and years, many, many years to construct and to get through the regulatory process. Renewables, on the other hand, are a lot more agile. They can be a lot less capital intensive, a lot more flexible in terms of where they can be built. If you think about a wind farm or a solar farm, a wind panel might take up a couple of square meters. A solar farm could be as small as a 1 acre lot or a 500 acre lot. So there's this kind of stackable nature to it, whether you're talking about solar or wind. And that means that there's a lot more flexibility in terms of where projects can be built. You see solar on rooftops, and that's not just limited to residential homes. That's also a large portion of industrial manufacturing, logistics. Anybody who's got a ton of land is starting to see interest from renewable developers who are looking to site projects. The problem with renewables is that they're often reliant on uncontrollable elements. The sun is only shining some of the time, the wind is only blowing some of the time, and so on. So this intermittency of the power supply means that it's not as it's not as reliable as your traditional baseload sources like coal or gas. And when you're dealing with mission critical operations, whether it's a hospital or a data center or even a prison, you really can't afford to have reliability of your power at risk. And so I think that's where there has been a lot of reluctance, particularly from the data center industry, to incorporate renewables. But I think with the rise of battery storage, that is a really exciting opportunity to combat the issue of intermittency, because then it's possible to bank that power and use it later, which means that you can have a more dynamic system, even at a large scale, like a couple 100 megawatts. You can take a portion of that from the grid. And if you have a commercial or utility scale battery on site, you could also have renewables, leveraging those resources when they're available, banking it in that battery. And then you're relying on a mixture of the battery supplied energy storage and then also the grid. And I think that combined with renewables really enhances the feasibility and makes it not such a pipe dream, so to speak, in terms of their ability to help offset some of that demand.
Mm-hmm. And the Inflation Reduction Act, it's winding down earlier than expected. What does that mean for individual energy projects getting financed?
Look, I think that the IRA created and expanded a number of helpful subsidies that were available to the energy sector. Primarily, those were in the form of tax credits and discounted debt products. And so with the rolling back of IRA, this just means that there's additional pressure for energy projects to pencil on their own, meaning the economics have to be good enough that the subsidy is not going to be something that makes or breaks commercial viability. So for larger, well-sited, high-demand projects that have enough scale, have a low enough cost in terms of their technology, and have customers ready to take that supply, it's not going to affect them. But for some of the smaller projects, as well as some of the smaller developers, I think we're starting to see some consolidation of the market. So projects are getting bought out, and even companies are being bought out by the larger players. And so this just means that the diversity of who can play in this space and the projects that are financially viable is shrinking. So we'll see sort of a floor, I think, being established for what makes a new energy project commercially viable. But at the end of the day, we have seen the levelized cost of renewable technologies come down significantly in the last decade, particularly. And so, while it's unfortunate that some of these subsidies are no longer available or that they're going to be sunsetted, I do think that the clean energy sector is really reaching this pivotal point where the economics do make sense in a lot of places. And so it's not the end of the world, I think, when we look at the renewable sector. And I think as utilities face some of the constraints that we were just talking about, we may see more evolution in the policy and subsidy space. So I'd say it's kind of a watch and wait scenario right now, particularly when you layer on all of the supply chain issues that Meaghan mentioned. tariffs, Buy America, these factors are going to impact a lot of aspects of the industry, not just those who are in the renewables space, because they rely on the same inputs and component costs or the component parts. So I think the jury's still out. We'll see some market consolidation. It's certainly going to make it a little bit harder for renewables to compete, but I don't think it goes away.
Meaghan, you mentioned something in our earlier conversation about the importance of corporate real estate and developers working closely with utilities and local authorities. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So it has to be a collaborative effort. It's got to be an ecosystem. If you think about the developers, the investors who are looking to build new, whether it's whatever kind of site they're trying to build, whether it's an office building or an industrial site or a data center, and then the occupiers who will eventually occupy that space potentially are doing the kind of the anchor tenant to make it happen and or are investing in it themselves. And you've got the utilities who are required to be involved from a power standpoint, a power access standpoint. And then you've got the local and state governments who are potentially, if it's a big move, they're maybe invested from a incentive standpoint to get the company to move there. So there's this ecosystem of how do all these parties, these stakeholders come together in a way that is going to provide the best outcome. So there's got to be absolutely this collaboration, and there will be pits and pulls. The conversation about people and place, that's a big thing, right? The location matters, and the access to talent that you need to not only work in the facility, in the site, also to manage the site. Those are all major factors that have to be considered. And for any given project, there will be one or more of those that becomes the priority, depending on the type of site that you're looking to build, depending on the need for it, the urgency of it. And it matters for all of those different parties to be really well aligned in the process.
And then there's the communities themselves too.
There's a lot of NIMBY out there.
No question. Yeah, absolutely. And when we're talking about access to power and the power rates, that the supply and also the cost of it, there can be a community impact in the short term, at least. So ensuring that that is all aligned, it's complex.
Absolutely. Here's a question for both of you. We mentioned innovation before. What are some of the innovations that you're seeing out there that are making you optimistic about the future of real estate and power?
I can jump in. So we work with several, I mentioned this earlier, several companies who are in the nuclear power business. And I've had the opportunity to visit some of their facilities and see the innovations that they're making from a safety standpoint, from a easier access standpoint. And that's exciting. When we think about the nuclear power as a cleaner source of energy than some others, and the innovations that are happening, the newest types of nuclear reactors and power plants are a lot safer in many ways than the ones that we've seen in the past, from the ability to leveraging gravity to make it possible that you can put out a fire with a garden hose rather than having to have electric water to get up to a column above ground. Other things that are exciting and make me feel optimistic that we've got great solutions out there that are coming.
I love that one. Yeah, I never thought in my lifetime that I would see a resurgence in the nuclear sector quite like we're seeing today. And maybe similar to that, when I was in school, I was an energy nerd then and still am now, self-pronounced. But I wrote my thesis on distributed energy and concluded that it was not going to be viable. And that was 20 years ago. And it was because at that time, distributed energy, it was like, why would you even do that? Unless you're a farmer or a hippie, it just didn't make sense, right? The utility sector kind of had things down, and you don't worry about things like energy or water or even roads until they don't work, right? And so now we're seeing this very fragile system under a ton of constraint and managing an onslaught of demand from a diverse array of sources. And in that constrained kind of pressure cooker environment, we're seeing a ton of innovation. So I love the example that Meaghan gave with nuclear, because that was kind of unexpected. But another one that I want to talk about is in the battery space. I mentioned that that's something I find really exciting. Even, 20 years ago, I remember being in college with some of my fellow students, not my students, talking about, well, if the cost of batteries could just come down, then that would make solar so much more viable. That would make it more adaptable. It would make it possible for some of these projects to really stand. So I think that innovation that we're seeing and that kind of cost coming down in the battery space is really, really exciting. But it's also about how batteries can be dynamically used, whether it's being coupled with renewables to solve energy issues around security of supply and demand management and price hedging, like we were talking about before. It also makes having that distributed energy system, that network, possible. So my conclusion 20 years ago is totally wrong. And now we're really seeing a future where real estate can play a much larger role in managing that broader ecosystem and helping to navigate this energy crisis. Frankly, if all of Meaghan's clients were willing to host a large battery on site in their parking lots or adjacent land, we may not need utilities to invest as much capital into new power plants or grid infrastructure. So to me, that's a really exciting innovation. And there's a lot of different kind of threads you can pull on that, but I'd say, yeah, batteries would be my pick.
That's pretty cool. This has been really great. One thing I ask all my guests is, what are you reading or listening to or watching that would provide further information on this topic? Can each of you provide one or two recommendations for my listeners?
Meaghan, you go. I want to know what you're listening to.
Okay, for sure. So this is not energy specific, but it certainly covers energy often. Every morning I listen to the Bloomberg Daybreak podcast. I think Josephine, you do, I've heard you say that you do as well. That is, to me, just a quick hit, 15 to 20 minutes of all the big things that are going on around the world. I also have a Google alert that I get every morning, and I have them on all the industries that my clients work in, including one for energy, one for utilities specifically. And so every morning I get that top headlines of what are the key articles that are popping up around the world in this specific area. So that way I can make sure that I'm at least getting the big stuff each morning.
Yeah, I love the Bloomberg one. Meaghan's totally spot on. It just gives you a quick hit of all the highlights that you need to know. It's typically the first one I listen to in the morning. The more energy specific ones that I really love, first and foremost, have to give a shout out to the Energy Gang. That's a long-standing fan favorite. Love the Energy Gang. And Jigar Shah, who some of your listeners might be familiar with, was our client at the Department of Energy and has come back to the Energy Gang podcast. So that's super exciting. Also love Switched On. If you want more on Bloomberg, Switched On is really great. They explore a lot of research, market trends, they have different speakers. I really love those too.
Okay. Shout out for Bloomberg.
Yeah,
what they're
exactly.
doing. That's great. Well, thank you both very much. It was nice to chat with you. Nice to meet you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah,
It's
this was
great.
fun. Thanks for
Great.
doing
Thank
that.
you. And thank you, listeners, for joining me on Sustainability Street. If you have any questions about this episode or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to me at Therese.Fitzgerald@cpe-mhn.com. Bye for now.